Watch out, old Joe. A Kennedy wants back in the White House.
I've come here today to announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. My mission over the next 18 months of this campaign and throughout my presidency will be to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is threatening now to impose a new kind of corporate feudalism on our country.
While Joe Biden drags his feet on a 2024 run, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is ready to challenge him for the Democratic nomination. The media is trying to write RFK Jr. off as a fringe candidate, but he's already snagging 14% of Joe's voters. That's no fringe. And 32% of Dems would rather have anybody but Biden. The president could stop all the Democrat backstabbing if he was popular and had a strong record to run on, but the White House can't even defend that.
69% of people polled by CNBC say they have a negative view of the economy. President Biden talks about the economy all the time. What?
He talks
Why
about
are people buying it?
He talks about the economy all the time because he wants the American people to know that he's doing everything that he can to make sure that his policies that he's put forward that has shown that he's building an economy that doesn't leave anybody behind. I know you're reading a poll right now. That is one poll.
There you go. It's just one poll. So, Dana, RFK offers an interesting intersection of stances, which makes his impact kind of hard to predict. Like, who does he hurt more, Republicans or Democrats? Obviously, he's hurting Biden right now. Yeah. But he's an old school liberal, anti-war, distrustful of government. But then what used to be hard left, which was anti-vax, is kind of now across all politics, but it can be hard right.
A lot of these things where people on the right and the left have met around on the other side, and I just sit there and go like, I'm not there, but I've watched it happen, and it's on several issues, many issues, including some of the labor union stuff. So a lot of Democrats rolling their eyes, right? They're saying, oh gosh, here we go again. But the 14% is one of the things. His name has the cachet, not as much as it used to. Yeah. But Camelot has kind of left the building on that one. But look at where he did the event. He had a very good rollout. He did it in Boston. Boston's media market shares with New Hampshire. Biden has really given the middle finger to New Hampshire by saying that we're going to do the first of the primaries in South Carolina instead. New Hampshire voters are, even if they're partisan Democrats, they're not happy about that. And so you might see if there's a way that RFK Jr. would be able to push Biden into having to debate. Now, you haven't seen the White House actually get concerned, and we know what can happen, and we'll talk about it in the show, about when the White House campaign, Biden's campaign gets going, they could even get, a couple of dozen national security advisors to say things that aren't true. So what kind of opposition research could they do on something like this if they put their mind to it? They might not think that they want to do it, but Joe Biden is a historically weak incumbent. So it is interesting. It's also probably very unlikely that he would go much further than even the 14%. But I'm willing to sit here and watch because I'm all 2024 an observer. Yeah. I'm going to call myself.
Geraldo, you saw RFK Jr. on Tucker. I mean, it's so interesting to see how different worlds collide from, like, you never thought you would happen, but this is how the world's changing. How is the Kennedy name? Does it have, do you think it has an effect? You've been on this planet for quite a long time.
Right. I've known them all. Doug Kennedy, his brother, was for many years my office mate. I think that he's going to be much more formidable than you have indicated, not you, but I mean, people are taking him with a grain of salt, but he's got the accent, he's got the nostalgia, he's got the looks. The anti-vax thing is less crazy now than it was a year or two ago. So I would submit that, I mean, he's not Gavin Newsom, who is still my favorite of that generation. I still think it's going to be Trump against Biden. But I think that Joe Kennedy Robert Kennedy Jr., excuse me, there's so many. Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to be a formidable force, a disruptor at the very least.
What do you say, Judge? Disruptor?
I worked with Robert Kennedy Jr. when I was the DA. I had an environmental crimes unit. I was very forward, very progressive in that regard. I found him to be a very ethical guy who really believed in what he was doing. He wasn't cheap about politics. He wasn't an easy mark. He was someone who believed in what he believed. And I think it'll be very interesting to watch him. I think when you put someone up like him against a Joe Biden, and we see he's taken 35% of the Democrats who don't like Joe Biden, who think he's too liberal, and 33% of Joe Biden's people who think that the economy is terrible. I think he has an opportunity if he's given that opportunity. He is almost like, and it's curious, Dana, the way you describe it, coming around in the back, you know, the left and the right kind of meeting back there somewhere. I think that people will find in him, if there's enough of a chance, and I know his family is trashing him. His family, the Kennedy family, is trashing him. They're so left, so progressive, they don't want to deal with him. But I think that some Americans will find him to be kind of reminiscent of better times in America. And I think it'll be very interesting to watch. He's not about corporate greed. Yeah. He's not about running around the world and sucking up money with a vacuum cleaner, you know, for the family.
He might be, I don't know. I had issues with him for going back probably 20 some odd years, just because I worked in the health journalism area, and the anti-vax movement was one of the most strident, ideologically, like, hardcore. But he turns out that now he's known for this stance, the COVID stance. So it's like, I wouldn't say he's a stop clock and that he was finally right, but what do you make of that now? I mean, it's weird how he's now become kind of a folk hero of people who aren't typically liberals.
So what you're saying is all those years of being anti-vax might have been vindicated because of this most recent vaccine, even news this week. Yeah. I don't know if those other vaccines pose anywhere near the threat that he believes and puts out there, but I don't think that the left and right meet in the middle around the back of the political sphere. I think that a lot of Americans sit here in the middle, and when they are not on a team that's, you know, Kevin McCarthy's team or Joe Biden's team, then they're just focused on things that affect their lives. When you talk about farmers that want to be able to raise a farm without Monsanto owning them, when you talk about people that want to raise their kids without teachers indoctrinating them, when you talk about people that want to, I don't know, not pay all their money in taxes, or, as we'll talk about later, pay more because they have good credit, that's really not political ideology. That's middle class or low class people trying to live their lives. And if you can show up and actually do something for those people, rather than being someone like Joe Biden or many Republicans who make a platform out of pretending to do something for those people, you're going to get 10 or 14%. But what I want to know is, if these obscure candidates are doing that good against Biden, who are the real contenders? And I don't mean to say he isn't, but who are the ones that are looked at as real contenders that are chomping at the bit to jump in? Maybe there aren't any, because maybe all those have already sold their soul to the far left. I don't know.
It's a good way to look at it. And I just want to say, like, in my ear, while we were talking here, news has just crossed. We have not confirmed it yet at Fox News, but like I think the New York Times is reporting that apparently Joe Biden will announce he's running for re-election next Tuesday in a video. Washington Post, excuse me, Washington Post, in a video. So next Tuesday.
It's a good video.
That will be April 25th.
All right.
In case you're counting. So that news just came across.
You know, what a shock. You know, the guy's doing it in the video. I mean, he can't come out.
Right, and it comes right as they are gathering. The Biden fundraisers are coming this week. Or this weekend. Yes. So they probably had to figure out a way to. He probably already cut the video on a good day.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe the job's not that hard after all. You know?
Are you up for it?
No, I'm going to wait till 2028.
Can we put your name
forward?
Watch
out, America. Me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kilmeade. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to click to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page. This is the only way that I know for sure that you're not going to miss any great commentary, any great news bites, any great interviews coming your way on Fox. You can get it all here on YouTube. So subscribe right now.